Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I've got answering student questions. Actually, just one question this time. This is an excerpt of what became a 5.5-hour video that I made for my students this summer. Right? They asked in a discussion forum a series of 25 questions, 25 students, 25 questions, and I decided I would do a video response to them. In my class, when I'm doing face-to-face, they ask anonymous questions, and I have to stand in front of the class and give somewhere between a 2 and a 5-minute response. Now, I'm not limited to the 5 minutes since I was on video, and obviously I wasn't limited because I went for hours and hours and hours. Some students got an entire lecture in response. So I've taken a couple of those questions, and I've made small videos out of those. And then eventually I'll publish the entire video. But I just want to remind you, as you listen to my responses, these are mostly on the fly. I mean, I didn't do a lot of preparation to answer these questions. I simply looked at it and said, here's how I would respond to that. Here's some thoughts of mine. And those thoughts also are in the context of this is a class that has a broad spectrum of students in it from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different opinions about mostly the topic of evolutionary biology. And so my responses have that in mind. Some of my responses are a little different than maybe the tact I would take if I were sitting down with you over a cup of coffee and talking about these subjects, or if I was talking to a specific critic or something like that. So just bear that in mind in terms of the style of response that I'm going to provide for some of these questions. I'm also in a sort of a teaching mode because I'm trying to use my responses to help them understand some principles. So I'm breaking down some of their questions into fundamental assumptions and trying to derive sort of like things that I know that they're going to need to know, through the rest of the class, and trying to sort of squeeze those elements into my answers to their questions. Okay, so with that caveat, or those caveats, let's proceed to answering a student question. Coming on up. Life on other planets. Okay. I grew up in a Roman Catholic household, but the ideas and theories of evolution were never taboo. We simply accepted that everything was God's creation. However, one taboo topic in the house was the idea of the possibility of life on other planets. I simply see that the universe was created so infinitely large that there has to be at least some microorganism somewhere else at the very least. Other members of my family say otherwise and are adamant that we're alone because we hold dominion and as the smartest and most sentient creatures on the planet, created by God to govern and care for the other life around us. My argument is that even if that was the case, and we are the only higher thinking creatures, there should still be something the equivalent of a squirrel or something somewhere else in the universe. How can we know for certain that we're alone in the universe when the only things telling us that we are the Bible and the fact that, to our public knowledge, I like the hint to, the whole UFO thing that's happening right now, or is always happening, to our public's knowledge, that nothing has tried to contact us. Okay, so the question of life on other planets. I think the person asking this question is, they're making some really good points here, right? They're suggesting that if the universe is absolutely huge, right, which it is, absolutely, septillions of stars, which means there's septillions upon septillions of planets. And out of all those planets, this goes, now of course we're going to be touching on the idea of the origin of life again. If you start with an assumption that the origin of life can happen through some kind of natural process, right? There's some certain set of conditions under which amino acids and organic compounds can assemble in certain ways such that you could organize them eventually into something that's a cell that then also self-replicates, right? If you start out with that presupposition that is possible, then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if there's septillions of planets, the vast majority might not ever have those conditions, right? But out of all those planets, you would think that the same conditions would have to arise several times. And so you'd think that the odds are that there would be other places that have life as well. Now, I'm not touching on the idea that there might be different kinds of life, because how do you define life? That's a whole couple hour discussion itself. But let's say carbon-based life forms that have some kind of information storage vesicle, all right? Something like DNA. Could be RNA, could be something like that, all right? You would say that statistically speaking, it seems likely that there's other forms of life on other planets. Now, this person's also recognizing, like, hey, it doesn't mean that there's people on other planets. This raises also, I have to point out that this is the whole thing of, like, if you replay the tape, if you were to go back and say, like, if I were to take the Earth back in time, then you had the origin of life, and then you were to allow it to evolve again, would we have all the same organisms we have today? Right? Would we have human beings, and would we have all the different kinds of organisms we have today? And the answer to that, by some people who think about these types of things, is that there's no expectation to have the exact same thing, because all of those different organisms are evolving in the context of all the other organisms around them, right? And then, of course, there's external factors. There's comets, there's impacts, there's volcanism, there's all these different things that have then disrupted the process of different species forming. And so to say that we'd have exactly the same species or exactly the same kind of living, the exact same life on Earth today, if you were to redo all of history, would be to say that somehow every single event would have to have happened the same way. But it's like the butterfly effect. If you had one small difference somewhere along the line, and you had bacteria, multicellularity evolved in a slightly different way with slightly different genes, you might not get the clear distinction between animals and plants, right? And fungi. You might get some other group that has an amalgam of different features that we don't have today. But on the other hand, I think most biologists would say that the thing about the world today is there's a certain economy to it. You have herbivores, you have phototrophs, things that gather energy from the sun, well, and chemotrophs too. All right, they're building molecular organic molecules. Then you have heterotrophs. You have organisms that thrive and eat and basically consume other organic molecules that other organisms have made. And you have detritivores. All right. You have fungi, you have other organisms that eat things that are dead. All right. So, but which is really just a way of saying they're also eating organic compounds that something else has made. Right. And then on land, you got trees, and you have grass, and you have large animals, you have small animals, you have insects, right? They each have a niche, right? They're each taking advantage of different resources. And the expectation would be that if you were to draw out everything again, you would get similar types of organisms. Yeah. It's kind of like looking at one continent versus another, right? If you go to one continent, if you go to Australia, you have a whole bunch of different types of organisms there that don't exist anywhere else. They fill certain niches. There's plants that are adapted to the desert. They're very different than the plants that are adapted to the desert in California, right? There's cacti there. There are no cacti in Australia, but there are plants that have spines there. So what you get is natural selection in the environment selects for characteristics, coevolution, right? Going back to another question again. You have the coevolution of similar characteristics by different means, but you end up with the same sort of endpoints. You end up with plants that have a whole bunch of features that help them survive in dry climates. But they get there in different ways. And their genes are all different. Like I have these genes that make a certain kind of stomate and opening, and the plants over there in Australia, they have a different set of genes that make a similar type of characteristic that allows them to survive in their environment. And so the idea is that you would get, if you did the whole Earth's life system again, what would you get? You would probably get something that had like a mix of all these different kinds of organisms in different environments that have these different types of features, like flying things, small creatures, detritivores, large carnivores. You would expect all those different types of organisms to exist. And I think that's why it's helpful to think about different continents, because different continents are like saying two different Earths, right? They've been separated by continental drift, for long periods of time, and they've each evolved a unique set of organisms, but they kind of fill the same roles. Flying squirrels here in North America, sugar gliders that are marsupials are in Australia, and to the untrained eye, they kind of look like the same type of organism, and they fit the same habitat, and they're both nocturnal, and they do similar things, but they're completely unrelated organisms. All right, so what does that have to do with this question? It suggests that if some form of life exists on another planet, and that form of life has existed long enough, it should develop into different things that fill lots of different niches in similar ways. And so you could kind of predict you should see similar types of organisms in different places. All right, now all of that, let me step back. I want to say that all of this rests on the idea that that making life from non-life is possible in this sort of naturalist, in a completely naturalistic way. So some of you might be convicted that that's not possible, that it takes supernatural intervention to make life, right? Maybe that's your conviction. And because maybe you look at the evidence for the origin of life and say, like, well, that really is more speculative, right? I don't have like really firm evidence of how that would happen. And so it is like, I prefer to believe that this is a guided process, that a supernatural creator has made these things. So like just in here, we accept that it's all God's creation. For this person saying like, the universe was created infinitely large, there has to be at least some sort of organism. Now they're actually suggesting that maybe even if God is in charge, right, has made the universe, that he has given, because God has created the whole universe and is governed by the same rules. If I go to another planet, a water molecule is the same as a water molecule here. Erosion happens the same way. If I have carbon dioxide and I have nitrogen, they're going to potentially combine in the same types of way, because the laws of chemistry operate in a similar fashion all across the universe. And so then you get back to the idea that, well, if those laws, and if they're the laws that God instituted, right? So if you have a theistic viewpoint of why the laws exist, you could say that the universe exists in such a fashion, or was given the ability to generate living things. And then if you have evolutionary mechanisms at play, you could really predict that you would get similar kinds of organisms in similar habitats on other planets. I like this point here, that the argument be that in the case that only higher living creatures, there should still be other types of organisms. To say that because human beings are at the pinnacle, and again, this would be a perspective that says that man is specially created and is a kind of like a higher being than all other living things, right? Separated from all living things. Whether they're separated biologically or not, separated in the sense of being endowed with a special position in the universe. And this is where I think individuals who would believe this would say that they wouldn't expect there to be people on other planets. And by the way, even if you had a wholly naturalistic outlook on the origin and evolution of life and the history of the universe, I don't think that you should predict that there would be human beings on another planet based on everything I've just said. Right? If you replay the tape, right? The butterfly wings aren't flapping its wings aren't going to result in the exact same patterns every single time. And so you might be able to predict there could be a similar form of animal, but it certainly wouldn't be a human species. And then you could get into the whole consciousness thing and where does that come from, and maybe unique human attributes. And, fortunately, nobody asked me about that, so we don't have to talk about that. So I guess we could just, to kind of sum that up, the idea that human beings are unique and somehow have dominion over creatures on Earth, that's definitely a theological and philosophical perspective. All right, definitely rooted in religious belief. So I think it's really important at this point to recognize that what we're talking about here is Science and religion potentially having different perspectives and different approaches to answering really fundamental questions about why, right? We're discussing in this class hypotheses about how biological organisms adapt and change in their environments, and what the possible inferences from that are. And one of the inferences is that all life might be related to one another. In fact, there is actual evidence, all right? There are actual arguments one could make that show that organisms are potentially related to each other or are related to one another. But nonetheless, you still have the question of sort of the why questions out there. There's no doubt that scientific discoveries have, at many times in intervals in the history, last several hundred years of history, have challenged previously held, I would say, religious and philosophical beliefs. The history of scientific progress includes instances where scientific understanding expands our perspective, like on our place in the universe. Right? Telescopes have certainly expanded our understanding of our place in the universe, and have actually asked us to forced us basically to ask questions that never would have been asked in the past. So how you individually, reconcile like scientific discoveries and your personal beliefs, and your why questions about the world, right, is really a very, it's a really deeply personal and subjective matter. And all I can do is provide explanations that are like, here's what science can say about the origin of life and how organisms change. And here's the best understanding of scientific principles applied to these questions that we have today. Okay, I've been rambling on this question a whole bunch, and I'm kind of avoiding giving a personal perspective on this. But I'll hold off because we got some other questions. We have some other related questions. So I promise I'm gonna touch on some more of these things.